of the National Academies of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and Internal Society of Learning Sciences. And I have to say, I've had the great pleasure of working on some projects led by Bill. So let's give a warm welcome to Bill.
I want to just do an access check and make sure people in the back can hear me. So I do want to thank the organizers of the conference, but especially my good friend and president of the New Mexico Science Teachers Association, Christy Brennan, for inviting me here. It's truly an honor to be here, and I'm humbled to be invited to speak with you here. I decided I wanted to use my time here, as I like to do often, to lift up work of different teams of colleagues and the work of others in science education that I've really had the privilege to be able to know and learn from. And this includes people that I've served with as part of a recent National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report on focused on pre-K through 12 STEM education equity. This was truly a dream team of scholars and practitioners in our field, and perhaps the most racially diverse consensus committee ever at the National Academies. And consensus committees and their reports are really important signs of what is to come in our field. They brought us the framework for K-12 science education, which led to the NGSS. And I want to acknowledge Shafiq Chadori here in the front row, who was a reviewer of this report. Thank you for your service for that report. I'm also today going to lift up the work of my colleagues who've been developing free instructional materials for the NGSS as part of the High School Developers Consortium for Open SciEd. I am both a believer in the power of high-quality instructional materials in advancing equity, and a believer in the need to honor and encourage teachers' adaptation of these materials to address the interests and community priorities of their students. And I'll share some things today that we did in building materials that I hope are useful for here and for teachers in New Mexico. I do want to provide some background on some of the relationships that I hold that are important to me, in part to animate around what animates my particular concern for educational equity. After all, I'm showing up as an Anglo man, a guest on native lands, whose ancestors were colonists who traveled overland from North Carolina to Tennessee some 200 years ago, the same state where I was born and grew up. Growing up, though, I still did maintain relationships with people in the queer community in Nashville, as my mother had a female partner of 9 years of my own childhood and adolescence, at a time when Nashville was not a very welcoming place for queer people. Values of speaking up and speaking out and creating welcoming spaces for queer people and trans people are both important to me. My family today is another important set of relationships that I hold, and I want to give a shout out to my wife Edie, who is here today presenting a workshop representing her organization, the National Center for Women in Information Technology. I'm also not a science teacher, nor have I ever been, which makes me keenly aware of the need to stay in good and continuous relationship with science teachers and leaders. I always work in partnership in co-design with teachers and educators in my work, trying to remember what I don't know, and also lifting up wise practice wherever it shows up. Last, growing up in the South made me super aware of race and racism, and thanks actually to ministers in my Presbyterian church and history teachers helped me form an ethical commitment to the pursuit of racial justice. Over time, my work in science education has led me to form more and more connections with scholars of color who have influenced my thinking and inspired me to shift my focus more sharply on equity and justice in science education. In addition, my time with Indigenous elders in my 20s and my current relations with Indigenous scholars like Megan Bang and Ananda Marin make me keenly aware of my answerability to Indigenous communities. In that connection, I come from the lands of the Ute, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho peoples here in what people today call Colorado. And I acknowledge here that I'm a guest on the homelands of the Pueblo of the Sandia people here on the UNM campus. And I seek to honor Indigenous presence on Turtle Island today by highlighting examples of projects in science education that are part of larger efforts to sustain Indigenous cultures in the face of ongoing threats of erasure. I also invite us to remind ourselves of the ethical imperative to repair and maintain good relations among people and with lands and waters, which we can show here in the kindness and respect that we show for each other today. I begin with a premise that STEM education in the United States has long been marked by inequities, where access and experiences vary widely, depending on factors such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, language, gender, sexual diversity, identity, and more. Many communities, especially those in underrepresented groups, have been systemically and systematically excluded from opportunities in STEM education and careers, or their contributions have gone unrecognized. The lack of inclusion means that for many, achieving personal or financial success through STEM feels out of reach, and additionally, STEM advancements have not always benefited everyone equally. What may be considered progress in one community can often result in negative consequences for others, reinforcing the importance of fostering equity and inclusion in STEM fields. A lens through which I understand equity efforts in STEM involve efforts at repair. Repairing relations with families, with communities, and with the land. Through thought of this way, the work of equity is about mending our connections and then maintaining them. We go about this work by showing our commitment to get to know and appreciate the strengths of families, communities, and our kinship with the land, and by reflecting on how we know what we do in our classrooms, whether it's mine at the university level or yours in a K-12 setting. How well does that reflect about those strengths in our efforts to build towards them? And I will warn you, this will be a little bit of an interactive talk, so I'm going to have you think and talk with me about this. To make our systems more equitable, we need to understand how we got here, where we are, and the experiences of children and youth, and the key elements of the system that shape what we do every day. The latter include the standards that are set, the assessments we use, the instructional materials, professional learning experience available to us. It also includes how accountability systems and the ever-present influence of literacy and mathematics have on us as teachers in science. I'm not going to dwell much on this diagram in this space because I want to focus on what each of us can do to promote equity, acknowledging that we find ourselves, though, somehow answerable to all these elements. We're not free actors able to do whatever we want in the classroom. We have to be responsive to these things. And sometimes that feels like a lot, and it feels like that's influencing our abilities to address equity. So what I do want to spend some time on is a key idea in our equity report. And in this next time, I'm going to ask again, as I said, for a little engagement with you and the audience. It's going to require a little vulnerability to talk about your own ideas about equity in science education. And I'm going to give you a minute or two before we engage things, just to think about what equity means to you. And also how it shows up in decisions that you've made or about your classrooms. And how you show up for students and what you advocate for. So a key concept in this report is that inequities are a consequence of decisions made over decades, centuries in fact, to marginalize, to discriminate against, to culturally erase, and commit harms against groups and communities based on race, ethnicity, indigeneity, language, ability, immigration status, class, and more. Conversely, each of us makes decisions each day, wherever we are in the system, that can work towards attenuating inequities and move towards justice. So, if you have a pen or pencil, your computer, and I invite you to take a minute or so to jot down, otherwise you can think about this. If you have a phone, you've got a notepad, you can write on there. What does equity in science education mean to you? And how does it show up in decisions that you make? So take a minute now, I'll time this, and then I'll have you turn to a neighbor and talk about that. All right, I'm going to ask you to turn to one or two other neighbors. You'll have about 4 minutes to share a little bit. Relationship first. Say who you are if you don't know the person. And tell them how you're showing up today, just first. And then get into this discussion, okay? These ideas, we're going to come back to them in a little bit. And what I wanted to do is share one of the core pieces of work we did as an equity committee was to look at all the different ways that people are thinking about and talking about equity, both in the field of practice and in policy and also in research. And what we did is build off of conceptualizations of equity that were identified first in another National Academies report focused on pre-K through 5 elementary. And we talked about these as frames for equity. And what does framing mean here? It really just means how we conceptualize and communicate about the problem of inequity, and also how we propose solutions, with the aim of making sense of issues and possible solutions, as well as mobilizing people to act toward equity. A frame is kind of just a whole way of thinking about equity. So there are 5 frames, and I'm going to go through them first just with an overview, and then I'm going to give you an example of some programs so you can really see what solutions that are grounded in these different frames look like and how different they can be. So the first one is reducing gaps between groups. And that emphasizes reducing gaps between different groups based on race, gender identity, or some other factor, often related to achievement, but also whenever we talk about interest, we often talk about an interest gap. And that relates to representation and also representation in the STEM workforce. Whenever we talk about gap closing, we're using this frame. Another way we often talk about equity that's very common is expanding opportunity and access. And that involves eliminating differential access to high quality opportunities to learn in STEM. The source of these differences typically imagined as differences in social and material resources necessary to learn, access to well-prepared educators, a network of adult and peer supporters of learning, and high quality curriculum. Less common are these next 3 frames that we'll spend some time on. The third one is embracing heterogeneity in STEM classrooms. And that involves really engaging fully with the concerns, the lived experiences, and identities of students who have been and often continue to be marginalized in STEM education programs. It emphasizes on embracing different ways of thinking, feeling, and being of young people within STEM classrooms. Equity Frame 4, learning and using STEM to promote justice, emphasizes learning STEM as a resource within movements for social and socio-ecological justice. This can include engaging young people with STEM learning in ways that allow them to engage directly in actions that work towards remedying injustices experienced in their communities, or to contribute to larger justice projects. Equity Frame 5, envisioning sustainable futures through STEM, emphasizes a role for STEM education in cultivating equitable, just, and thriving social and ecological futures that attend to and support both ecological and human well-being. The frame is very forward-looking, including potentially reimagining the very structures and settings of schooling. Each of these frames is a different way of thinking about equity. Maybe you're thinking that you align with one of these more than others. All of them can be useful, is the stance we took in our report, depending on the decision that you have to make before you, like what materials you're going to teach, from tomorrow, or how you're going to respond to a student's idea when you're finding a student hard to understand, or what kind of professional development you're going to advocate for in your department or your school. To explore these a little bit more deeply, I'm going to focus on some of the different kinds of solutions, that is, programs and practices that are linked to these different frames. And then I'll have you talk to a partner about your thoughts about the different frames. And I'll emphasize again, these are all programs with some evidence to back them up, and that I think are worth thinking about and thinking with. So we often think about achievement gaps between groups, but we often also can talk about interest gaps. This gap talk locates both the problem and the solution at the end of the day with our students. So interventions focused on gap reductions focus often on bringing up a member of a marginalized group through some intervention, rather than changing the culture of the classroom or the system. One intervention of this type actually is really simple, and it's intended to help the perceived relevance of science instruction without actually changing teaching or curriculum at all. And it involves having students write a short paragraph about the usefulness or utility of a unit or course that they've just been studying. And a study in this case was conducted of this intervention with high schoolers, and where they just had to, in the treatment group, they wrote a summary of their material, the comparison group, and in the treatment group, they talked about why it was relevant to them. And they wrote in notebooks about every 3 or 4 weeks from the beginning of the semester for a whole semester. And the study found that students with low expectations of success in the course recorded more interest in science at the end of the semester and received higher course grades in the relevance condition more than in the control condition. Whereas with students with high expectations of success reported similar amounts of interest and course grades regardless of the experimental condition. There were no interactions with gender or race, meaning the intervention didn't close gaps related to those two identity markers. But this is an example, a rare one, I would say, of successful gap closing intervention, where those who are low achieving and those who have less expectation of success in science actually benefited from an intervention that didn't impact high achieving students at all. An area where children's access to science is limited is, as probably everyone in this room knows, the elementary grades. State leaders in science describe it as a back burner subject because there's such a strong emphasis on math and language. They also see state-level accountability policies and mandates as contributing to marginalizing science at the elementary level. It's also been an area that since 2015 has had far less funding for professional development. That's the year when ESSA took over and the Math Science Partnership program, which funded a lot of professional learning, went away. One thing that state leaders in science have done to promote elementary science is by incentivizing the adoption of high-quality instructional materials. States have provided resources in the form of professional development to districts and choose materials from state lists of high-quality materials. Louisiana has been particularly successful in adopting this approach, and as a result, there are a number of elementary schools, like this one shown in the picture in the Baton Rouge area, that are devoting more time to science. This is an example of the power of it using the expanding access frame to advocate for and incentivize time for elementary science during the school day. An example of a project that draws on the embracing heterogeneity frame is Tech Tales. Tech Tales is a community-based project that includes a university science center, a library, an indigenous theater group for youth, and the Native American program of a school district near Seattle, Washington. In the project, families are invited to develop, tell, and animate stories from their own lives using robotics, components, sensors, and everyday materials over the course of a 5-week series of workshops. Grounded in an understanding of learning as a cultural process, the program actively promotes multiple ways of knowing and making in STEM, and it begins with the premise that STEM learning should begin with the lives of learners and reposition family members as experts, no matter whatever their formal preparation in STEM. The program positions parents as co-facilitators in this, and it centers members' own family and cultural knowledge in the stories that they created and told. The program elevates participants' observations of and ways of relating to land, drawing on indigenous ways of knowing and being. Consistent with the idea of embracing heterogeneity at all levels of programming, the team uses co-design and co-facilitation as a way to design alongside or with partners rather than for them. The fourth frame, the justice frame. There's a long-term partnership between a group called the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization with science teachers from the Greater Lawndale Little Village High School for Social Justice in Chicago that illustrates how this frame can be used to organize learning opportunities at the intersection of science and activism. The partnership is part of a climate justice initiative begun in 1994 when an area in Chicago populated primarily by immigrants from Mexico within an area. The wider movement goals are aimed towards building a different economic future, not based on extraction, but on regeneration and sustainability. The curriculum of the school, it's a small school housed within a larger school campus for neighborhood residents, integrates the work of the activist organization directly into it, weaving the work of its campaigns into multiple science courses in the school. Staff of the two organizations have over time played roles in both the school and the activist organization. And students contribute directly to the work of campaigns through participating in activism, door knocking, planning, and leading workshops with the community to garner supports. And students study not just the science, but the wider economic systems that are perpetuating the climate crisis. A fifth frame. An example of a programmatic effort to shift institutional relations among families, schools, and communities towards more sustainable futures is the Learning in Places Collaborative. We in the Open SciEd group, will talk about this in a bit, collaborated with this group. At one level, Learning in Places is a curriculum project, building new kinds of interdisciplinary science instructional materials for preschool and elementary level children. At this level, it's innovative in the frameworks of helping children imagine and explore their ethical responsibilities to the planet now and in the future, and to be able to empirically examine the consequences of decisions made in the past and by them and their families in the present for human communities and for non-human species and natural kinds in the world. Young people are invited to engage in a deep examine of human relationship to the natural world right in their own homes and neighborhoods and connect them to broader scales of time and place. Learning in Places as a curricular resource also includes educator frameworks that orient educators to models of socio-ecological decision-making, thinking about power, historicity, and the histories of places as well as community engagement. It's also innovative in the ways that it forms a partnership that includes universities, multiple community organizations, and tribal communities and schools. In this, it seeks to embody different kinds of relations and draw on the expertise of community partners for how to grow food and eat food in ways that regenerate healthy ecosystems. All right, so you have some new lenses, hopefully, to think with for equity. I'm going to have you turn and talk again. And talk a little bit with a partner. Again, we'll have about 4 minutes for this. Which examples, if any, do you want to learn more about? And which ones piqued your curiosity and why? Which examples, if any, push your thinking about what equitable science teaching can look like? And how do the examples help you understand differences and overlaps among the frames? Now, if you don't remember all of these, that's fine. The one that you remember is the one to talk about in this moment. So I'll give you a few minutes to chat. And all of these examples, too, are, by the way, in the equity report. And I'll turn on. You may have some questions about these frames. I'll ask you to hold them until the end, but maybe hang on to them. Comments too that you want to offer about them. I want to turn and talk a little bit about applying these frames as a lens for understanding and evaluating curriculum. For those of you who are thinking about adopting curriculum and thinking about piloting new materials, these can be really useful. And I'm going to use the Open SciEd development process that I had the privilege of being part of and leading for high school as a kind of way to walk you through how we think and use these different frames in the context of our work. So the consortium involved writers, curriculum writers and teachers from our Inquiry Hub research group at CU Boulder, from BSCS Science Learning, from Northwestern University, where the Storylines model comes from, and the University of Texas at Austin. We had collaborators also with Denver Public Schools, Learning in Places, as I've mentioned, and also the Science Educators for Diversity, Equity, and Social Justice, a group of educators and researchers who provided curriculum evaluation of our materials from the standpoint of cultural responsiveness and justice. And I want to walk through again how we use these different frames, hopefully pointing to places too where they can show up in the kinds of curriculum that you use, and also within the great improvisational teaching that you have to do to make curriculum materials sing. Curriculum materials by themselves are just inert things. Like, you have to make them work for you and adapt them in ways that fit. So I hope I can illustrate how these different understandings also bring something unique to the table about equity, that they all matter at the end of the day. I'm going to focus a little bit on expanding access to start with. Yay, New Mexico, thank you. You all have been one of the lead states here. But a key goal has been to expand access to high-quality instructional free materials that teachers can adapt to their local circumstances and to connect to their own students' interests and experiences. The partners in this have all been really key to ensuring that access is as broad as possible to materials. Our consortium, led by the Inquiry Hub group at CU Boulder, for example, was contracted to carry out this project by a nonprofit organization that provides all the overall guidance to the project and is responsible for distribution of the materials, as well as professional development providers at the conclusion of the project. And Yanira, who used to be here in the state, is now at Open SciEd as part of that role. There's also was a state steering committee for the project that provided input on design of materials at regular intervals, and they were responsible for recruiting teachers to participate in a field test of the materials. Members of the committee were either state education agency staff or their delegates. Shafiq had a big role in that here in Open SciEd for the parts that I was involved in. And these states, importantly, represented all regions with very different political persuasions, some very conservative, some very liberal, some middle-of-the-road states. Now that these have been released, there are free versions available at the website, but also there are distributors, commercial companies, who are customizing these that districts may choose to pay for. And that payment actually goes back into a fund at Open SciEd for the renewal of materials. We are also about addressing gaps. So choosing the phenomena to anchor units that invite students to build understanding in 3 dimensions and that are compelling too turns out to be not an easy thing to figure out. Many phenomena align to standards, but aren't necessarily interesting to kids, even when we believe them to be. It's particularly important here for us to foreground the interests of students who've been historically excluded from science and engineering fields, so that they could see science materials as a reflection of things they care about, as well as a window into possible futures for them in their world. So our team used a systematic process to consider the interests of students who've been historically excluded from science while also foregrounding standards. I don't know of any other curriculum development that has ever done this, that is national in scale. Just to illustrate it, our first chemistry unit developed for high school focuses on the phenomenon of sea level rise displacing communities along global coastlines. It recounts the stories of 3 communities particularly impacted by sea level rise, 1 Native American tribal communities and 2 African American communities. Students investigate alternative solutions to the challenge of sea level rise, including community-driven solutions as they answer a unit driving question. How can we slow the energy of the Earth on Earth to protect vulnerable coastal communities? In the unit, students learn to use typical early year mathematics taught in chemistry, like unit conversions, or stoichiometry, in support of sense-making about the potential impacts of human activity, the release of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the promise of solutions for mitigating ice melting near the poles. Now, the process we used to get to this one was a lengthy one. It included voices of teachers and researchers who led the design of materials, as well as those of students. It began with bundling the related NGSS phenomena, performance expectations or standards, in physical and earth science, followed by a deep analysis of those standards. The goal of the analysis is to understand exactly what is and what isn't in the new standards. Because a lot of the things that you think are there are not often there, and some things that are not, that are there are surprising. Then the design team came up with 8 different candidate engineering design problems and science phenomena to investigate that would likely lead to students posing questions related to the identified facets of understandings. If you know about the storylines model, you know that it's organized around student questions. So we have to backwards map. Will this phenomenon generate the kinds of questions that will lead kids to want to answer questions that will require the science knowledge in the standards? Next, we gathered survey data and analyzed survey data from 883 different kids from 40 different teachers' classrooms. We asked students to report on how interested they would be in each problem or phenomenon, and provide anonymously information about their race and ethnicity, gender, home language, and zip code. The sample included students from zip codes across the country in urban, suburban, and rural areas. With the standards unpacking and interest data in hand, the design team then deliberated about what would be the best anchor for the unit. The interest data in this case showed a clear winner among racially and ethnically minoritized students, as well as for female and gender non-binary students, and for emerging multilingual students. And that is there a way to stop polar ice melting before the sea level rises too much? And you may say, we're landlocked here in Mexico or Denver. There is no way kids are going to be interested in that. And I'm here to tell you this is why interest surveys matter. Kids in landlocked places really care about sea level rising. And you need the data to show that. And you wouldn't know that necessarily. There's no difference geographically in terms of interest in these kinds of phenomena, oftentimes. So this design problem was also of interest to many other groups, but based on the analysis of standards and how compelling they were for the students historically excluded from STEM, we chose that anchor to become the anchor for the unit. So while interest survey may make it more likely that students pursue questions relevant to their own priorities and those of the communities, it's not sufficient. Teachers need to be able to build a sense of shared purpose and agency among students for developing and pursuing questions that can drive learning forward. And so we try to bring in funds of knowledge and identity from students' own families and communities on a regular basis. Funds of knowledge and identity refer to the knowledge and practices that students bring to class and that they themselves value. The first lesson in one of the biology units on ecosystems, how do ecosystems work, and how can understanding of them help us protect them, illustrates how curriculum can create opportunities for students to build on their funds of knowledge and identity in generating questions that can drive them forward. Students are introduced to an initiative focused on a goal of conserving 30% of the land and water in the U.S. by 2030. They brainstorm criteria that people can use to decide whether and how to conserve lands and waters. And they investigate 4 regional cases of conservation in different kinds of ecosystems in the U.S. And as part of that, they develop initial models of ecosystem components and interactions, as well as human decision-making factors related to conservation. And as part of this home learning assignment in this lesson, they talk with a community member, a family member, friend, or neighbor, to find out more about examples of places, lands, or waters that have been conserved and share these with the class. And they become part of a public record of related phenomena to which the class can return to deepen students' understandings about ecosystems and connect them to matters of concern in their families and communities. Teachers can also build in opportunities in terms of addressing gaps for students to make connections between the science they're learning and matters of importance of them to their lives. Remember that study I told you about having kids write? So what we do is we introduce exit ticket questions throughout the units where kids are actually just simply doing a simple reflection on what it is that they've learned today that might be relevant or helpful. These come from our chemistry unit described earlier. After students have brainstormed possible solutions to help slow or stop sea level rise, they answer the question, what might these solutions, why might they be important to you, whether you live near the ocean or not? So it's acknowledging that kids live in all sorts of places. And after lesson 9, a lesson where they investigate why cool water can be on top of hot water, students reflect on the energy transfer might matter to them by answering this exit ticket question. What is a situation where energy transfer through convection might appear in or matter to your life in the future? These kinds of why it matters to me questions really do support students' own agency in building connections to science and engineering. In terms of justice and sustainable futures, our team collaborated with Learning in Places to adapt their framework for ethical deliberation and decision-making in socio-ecological systems to inform the development of lessons and design challenges. This framework is really powerful in that it emphasizes the need to focus decisions on the past that explain why systems function the way we do today, as well as how decisions that people make today impact people, animal, lands, and waters. It invites them to consider also the values that are going to guide their own decision-making in the context of classroom investigations and problem solving, positioning young people as problem solvers whose actions matter. A key goal for developers was to write lessons that disrupt the typical ways that relations between nature and culture are depicted in the science curriculum as well. The first unit in physics illustrates our approach to integrating learning about human systems into science and engineering learning. In this particular unit, students take up the question of how we can design more reliable systems to meet our community's energy needs. They began the unit by investigating the Texas power crisis of February 21. They read articles and they wonder about the complex social, environmental, and physical constraints inherent in making decisions about energy systems and apply them to creating a design of a reliable energy solutions that meets their community's needs, as articulated by interviews with friends and family members. So back to the community. The task is designed to give the students the tools to engage as citizens in their local and global communities for a better energy future. Teachers played a central role in helping design and provide feedback on units. In addition to employing former classroom teachers as writers, we engaged teachers who were part of our field test in co-revising units based on feedback that they and their colleagues gave. In the classroom, teachers play a central role too in shaping the learning because they're engaged every day with students in helping partner on both the direction of their learning and in supporting students in learning how to build knowledge together. This isn't always easy to get students to get the hang of, and so we've learned in creating field tests of materials. One reason this is really hard for students is that sharing ideas with others in small groups and classrooms carries a tremendous amount of social risk, particularly for students from non-dominant groups and communities. Instructional materials need to be able to enable more equitable participation in discussion and activities. In our work, each unit incorporates activities to articulate and reflect on a set of community agreements based on respect, equity, moving our science forward, and maintaining a commitment. We have really learned a lot through the field test of how central these community agreements are, the culture building. They're written into the curriculum, but they really depend on teachers' skillful use of these to do that. Now, I started by saying that our team is committed to supporting teachers in making their own adaptations and materials. We know that no one set of materials can work for every classroom context, teacher, or student. At the same time, we also know how much went into making these materials as strong as they possibly can be and supportive of as many students that have been marginalized in STEM as possible. So one thing we're turning to is how we can help teachers make modifications of materials. And as part of this work, we've been drawing on lessons from a project called the 5D Assessment Project, where we prepare teachers to design culminating assessment tasks that connect to students' interests and identities. In that project, teachers have participated in an online course that takes place during the semester after school, and we provide them tools for developing and customized tasks that could be localized. So one of the things that we're putting in the proposal for just to do right now is to think about how we can use that to replace some of the existing summative tasks with local tasks. So if you wanted to do something in New Mexico, you could do that, as well as designing your own exit ticket questions. And we have a set of tools at the www.5dassessment.org. I want to leave just a few minutes, a couple minutes for questions, but I want to try a strategy that we use to get kids talking, which is, why don't you turn and talk first about a question that you have that you might want to surface here. If you want to talk about this first question too, and you don't have a question, great, but I want to use this to generate a few questions. And Christy, when do we need to close? Tell me. 3 minutes. Okay, so take 1 minute for your question, and then I've got a couple questions. That time for questions. In the back, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Paul Romick, New Mexico State grant, New Mexico State University.
Hey.
So I'm trying to see how good your crystal ball is, because I'm thinking of STEM. I think of science and how it's evolving to STEM, and these equity frames, how important they are,
Yes.
relevant. And something that I see missing from the framework is particularly the frame on social ecological justice.
It's in frame, it's very explicit in frame 4. I'm sorry if I didn't give it much
Yes, with the
juice.
new report.
Yeah.
But it's alluded and it's not tackled fully in the framework.
Oh, in the framework for K-12 science education?
Yes, yes.
Oh, correct.
Yes.
Yeah, we have built on the framework, but gone far beyond it in terms of that.
So
And
what is
the-
the, yeah, sorry.
So
So
the-
what is the link between, remember, science, technology, and society? It went away, it's ebb and flows, and I'm wondering what is going to happen if one party or the other one wins in November. How do you see that moving forward? And maybe it's too political, but we need to be. We're humans,
Yeah.
we're political.
So one reason I will say that we came up with these multiple frames is that we realize everybody is in their own political context. And the goal is to give people a broad language, and maybe if you're used to using one frame, try out one of these other frames. And I really do hope that some people are going to use frames 4 and 5 to do their work and give us models for when other people are ready to take those up. But if all you can do is expanding access, that is still something you can do to promote equity tomorrow in your context. And I'm here to say I think that's important work too.
Thank you.
Yeah.